So, good evening, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here again for our third webinar in this series. Now, my name is Sara Santos. I'm the director of IngoC Cognitive Enhancement Center based in Portugal and operating online as well. We operate in English and in Portuguese across many aspects. And if you're new to IngoC, we work with education consulting, academic support, and tonight's theme is related to cognitive enhancement. We are a licensed provider of the Arrowsmith program. And this evening, we welcome Debbie Gilmore. She is the director of the Arrowsmith program based in Toronto and operating around the world. And an incredible aspect of Debbie's career is that before she worked with Arrowsmith, she was the head of diverse learning needs in Sydney, in Australia, which encompassed a group of over 100 schools. And just to put it in perspective, that's the largest education system in Australia outside of the government school. So please join me in welcoming Debbie tonight, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okie doke. Now, let's see if I get this correct. And you get to see my slides. Are they showing properly, Sarah?
They're about to emerge.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Sarah, for asking me along this evening to speak with your community. And hello, everyone, wherever you're joining from. It's great to be with you. And if you are in Europe, I know it's your evening, so we will make sure we keep this webinar right on time. And it really is a great pleasure to speak on this topic. It's actually really interesting. Over my educational career, it seems that executive function has these ebbs and flows, and every so often it pops its head up again as being a really hot topic. I mean, it's a hot topic in our lives every day, but every so often we just have this resurgence of importance or talking about the importance of executive function. So I'm really, really excited to be here and talking with you about this. This is the overview of what I'm going to talk about this evening. What is executive functioning? The brain's role. This is something that if you've attended Sarah's webinars before, you'll know that what we talk about is the brain a lot. And so today we're going to talk about the brain's role in executive functioning. And not only that, we're going to go one level of concept down there and look at what's underneath, what's happening in the brain in executive function. How does all the brain functions work together to help executive function? Quite often, Sarah and I are asked, well, how do we know if executive functioning is really strong or it's underperforming? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then talk about some of the research that has been done on the brain networks, as well as just tell you a quick overview of Arrowsmith, and then I'll hand it back to Sarah. And you'll notice on my slides, there's a lot of information. Many times I won't read out what's on the slides. I will talk in general terms because you'll get the recording and then you can read it. If you're interested in a particular slide, then you'll get that slide. So let's get started with what executive functioning is. It's a series of mental processes. So, and these would probably be familiar with you, these terms: working memory, flexible thinking, mental initiative, focused attention, and self-control. Quite often, we're also asked, along with executive function, we quite often are asked about attention. These are very closely linked, and I'll talk a little bit of this theme as we go through and why attention is connected with executive function. So I'm sure you'll agree that these processes are important in our lives. You use these processes every time you're solving a task. You need to have a working memory. You need to have really good flexibility of thinking, and of course that self-control. So those processes that I just talked about are responsible for many things in the actions that we are required to do, or the tasks we are required to do every single day. So these are the actions. These processes are responsible for these things: decision making, problem solving. How important is that? Sometimes you hear the term decision fatigue. Adults use that a lot because we're making decisions all the time. And if you're a parent, you probably have to double the number of decisions you make every day, simply by being a parent. These processes are responsible for driving our behavior, directing the behavior, and to achieve goals. I already talked about attention, very connected. We also use executive function, or these processes, to predict consequences and anticipate events, manage our time, manage our reactions. So that self-control that was in the process, we use that self-control to manage our emotional reactions to what is happening. We also use those mental processes are responsible for delaying immediate gratification. Also a hot topic in many arenas. And I'm sure as parents and educators, you would have had a conversation about this in the last 6 months. And then, of course, we use past learning to plan for the future. So that's what executive function is. These are the processes that we are involved in executive function and what those processes are responsible for. Now let's focus on the brain's role here in executive function. If you've seen any of my webinars before, you've seen these slides, that the brain is our most important asset. And I would probably take a good bet that when you were doing any task today, not once did you think, my brain is helping me do this task. My brain, because I have a brain, I'm doing this task. We just go on with our day, get through whatever it is that we have to do. We really don't think about our brain. But we like to highlight it because it's so important. We have to really focus on the brain to understand these concepts and why we do what we do. So from any task, from anything that's very simple to anything that's complex, and executive function's quite a complex network and function, we are using our brain. And what are we using in our brain? All the networks in our brain that come together, depending on the task. All different networks of the brain come together to complete that task. So our brain really shapes who we are. And the really exciting thing is that we can control what our brain does. If we really give it some thought, we can control what our brain does. So looking at what underlies executive function, what is happening in the brain when we use that term executive functioning, or when we use executive functioning, I put together this diagram. Quite often the executive function is called the CEO, or the chief executive officer of the brain, because it directs the traffic. It directs what our brain is doing. So executive function happens in the prefrontal cortex. It's usually what we talk about, that the prefrontal cortex are the main networks that are on when we're using executive functioning. And the role of the prefrontal cortex, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, different functions in the left and the right, but by coming together, they are always looking for a problem to solve, always. So the executive function is always on. And though the executive function or the prefrontal cortex doesn't work by itself. It calls on another cognitive function in the brain, which we call symbol relations. It calls on this function that helps us understand concepts, helps us understand cause and effect. So if this, then this is going to happen, helps us connect the dots of information. So let's go over that. The executive function's always on, looking for problems to solve. The executive function calls on this other function to say, hey, help us solve this problem. So it needs information to solve the problem. So it comes together. Let's look at their brain networks and what happens here. What are the main networks? These are not, of course, the only brain networks, but these are the main networks that are coming together to solve these problems. And you'll see here in these images where they're located in the brain. These are images taken by brain scans of Arrowsmith students, actually, by the researchers that were investigating Arrowsmith. So we have the default mode network. The default mode network is the network that says, I'm thinking. It helps, the brain is saying, I'm thinking. The dorsal attention network is, okay, I'm thinking, but what's going on? What's going on here? The salience network is responsible for telling us what's important. So I'm thinking, what's going on? Oh, this is important. And the frontoparietal executive control network is, how should I respond to that? So that all of those networks are coming together to solve a problem. That executive function that's always on, these networks come together to solve a problem. Now, going back to that connection about attention, remember I talked about executive function and attention, or being really connected. You'll see here that frontal parietal executive control network is how should I respond, and the dorsal attention is what's going on. All of these coming together, and even the salience here, the attention on what is really important. So this is where these two concepts come together. So that executive control, sorry, that executive functioning is using all of these networks coming together. So let's go back to this image here that I had. So the executive function's always on, looking for a problem to solve, calls on this function to tell us, what am I understanding here? What is the connection of the relationships I'm needing to have to solve this problem? And then the executive functioning will call on other functions, because these three functions that I've talked about, the two functions in the prefrontal cortex and symbol relations where the light bulb is there, they're not the only functions that are required to solve a problem. So what then will happen is it will call on other functions. Here on this slide, you'll see the little footsteps. This is a function that helps work out the steps to solve the problem. So you know the problem, you know the concept about it, you understand the topic, but how am I going to solve the problem? The function of predicative speech helps the steps. This, then this, then this, then this. And then it will also call on many other functions, because those four alone, even they're so important, but they're not alone, because then you might have to be able to read something, you might have to write something, you might have to communicate by speech, you might have to remember something. So you're then calling on a number of other cognitive functions. So executive function does not work alone. What are some of those other cognitive functions? Here are some descriptions. Again, I'm not going to read these out, but these are probably 10 of the most important cognitive functions we use every day. They're not the only cognitive functions we have, of course, but these are probably the 10 most important that we use in the tasks that we do in our everyday lives. And we, of course, at Arrowsmith have names for these. It's not an exam here. You don't have to remember these. But if you're curious, you'll be able to find explanations for these on our website. So let's have a look at what lies beneath executive function. What are those cognitive functions, those four in particular that I talked about, that are coming together? So on the right-hand side of this slide, you see symbolic thinking and nonverbal thinking. That's happening in the prefrontal cortex. Symbolic thinking in the left prefrontal, nonverbal thinking in the right prefrontal. Symbol relations is that light bulb, and predicative speech, the little feet. So let's have a look at these discretely. What are each of these cognitive functions responsible for? Nonverbal thinking is responsible for planning and organizing, but in non-language, non-verbally. So this is where it's responsible for social cues, for understanding a situation, but not verbally, and then planning in non-verbal, in a non-verbal way, how you're going to execute the next action. It's non-verbal thinking that's also responsible for that self-control, that impulse. That's non-verbal thinking. Symbolic thinking, the left prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for thinking, planning, and organizing in language. So that goal setting, task execution, maintaining attention. That's symbolic thinking. Then we have symbol relations, the one that I showed before as the light bulb. That is probably the most important cognitive function that we use every day. Yes, executive function is important, but the executive function will not operate without symbol relations. And it's symbol relations that drives the execution of a task. So this needs to be super sharp. And so symbol relations is responsible for understanding and connecting ideas. It processes the complex relationships. Sorry, I just have to have a drink. It processes the complex relationships and the concepts. So it's like the comprehension aspect. And it's not just in reading, and it's also in verbal language. So understanding conversations, understanding what is being read or what is being written. And so just super important. It also is responsible for critical thinking, logical reasoning. So you can see how important this is for making decisions. And executive function is all about making decisions, and you can't do it without symbol relations. And then predicative speech, as I talked about, the little footsteps, this is responsible for that sequential logic. So if this, then that I have to do this first, then this, then this. Now, of course, we use predicative speech all the time in executive function, in solving mathematical equations, in solving scientific tasks, in working out what are the steps I have to undertake to get up in the morning and get out the door. So these are the four cognitive functions that are super important in executive function. So what does this mean in real life? Let's have a look. So the summer's coming up. We might want to go on holidays. So the prefrontal cortex, that's the problem to solve. I want to go on holidays. So what do we have to do? What does that mean? Where do we want to go? What does that mean? Symbol relations coming in. Then where do I want to go? Prefrontal. Okay, you've got to make decisions. How are you going to get there? Well, how are we going to get there? We have to follow certain steps. Predicative speech. How much vacation time do I have? Then you're using a different cognitive function of time. Then what do I want to see? That's object recognition, memory for information, because maybe you've read it somewhere before, or you've seen a visual, something visual that you want to see in a certain place. I want to write my itinerary. Okay, you're going to need motor symbol sequencing to write that down or type that up. You want to read about your destination, you're going to need symbol recognition there to be able to read. So you'll see cognitive functions of our brain and our networks don't operate in isolation. So that's why it's really hard to talk about executive function and only talk about the prefrontal cortex, because all of these other cognitive functions are coming together to solve the problem. Quite often, Sarah, as I mentioned before, Sarah and I are asked, how can executive function be assessed? Well, there's lots of formal ways, of course, and I want to talk about some other simple ways. Those cognitive functions I've been talking about operate on a continuum. They can operate at a superior level, at a supercharged level, or they can operate and they can underperform. So anywhere along a scale, and I promise you, none of us have all of our cognitive functions working up at one end. If you have a task that you sometimes avoid, it's the avoidance aspect of that probably means you've got a cognitive function that's underperforming. Quite often, some of us find another person to carry out or ask to help or carry out that function because we know that task is a little bit difficult. So that's just an indication of, where that we always find something a little bit difficult and where that might be. And that means that functions are working really well or underperforming. So let's have a look at using a cognitive lens and see if you know someone like this. Is there someone that you know that has taken on a leadership position, either at work, at school, or in a social circle? Can they absorb vast amounts of information and make complex decisions really skillfully? It's like, wow, look at how they did that. Do they manage different and even conflicting agendas successfully? They're juggling a lot of balls, but they execute so well. And you know what? They're calm about it. They never seem chaotic. They're just calm. They're able to execute those tasks really. It seems like it's simple for them. It probably means that their executive function is working up at the area of, above average, probably. What about children who keep track of their school assignments, can manage long-term projects? They can keep their attention on that. They can balance a part-time job along with their studies. They demonstrate independence and maturity. Sometimes these children are called the responsible one. Again, they probably have these executive cognitive functions operating up at that, at the positive end. But we also might know people that it could be a colleague, a family member, or a child who struggle to maintain jobs and relationships. They struggle to be independent. They need more time. They can execute tasks, but they might need more time. Or they might need help in organizing a task, the steps of a task to complete it. They need tasks. They need to take tasks home after work because they actually didn't have enough time to complete it at work. So they bring the work home. They seem to be a little bit irresponsible or impulsive or flighty. And they really find it difficult to juggle lots of things at the same time. Even two things can be really difficult to juggle. There might be children who need help to organize their day, or they need some strategies that are preset to help plan. Sometimes we put in strategies or tools like a phone, or there's apps to plan steps. So we put in some strategies there to help plan those daily tasks. Sometimes we might be using visual aids around the home or in the classroom to help children know what those steps are, because they can't hold those steps or understand those steps themselves. They will really need routines and understand the expectations. And they have to be predictable, not expectations that change all the time. They have to be really predictable. And they rely on their teacher or their parent to help them organize themselves. It probably means that their executive function is a little lower. So you don't need a formal assessment to recognize these behaviors. This is what we call a cognitive lens. So think about your child or your student, or a child or a student you know, maybe not in your family, but someone else. When encountering a roadblock on the way to school or work, or the bus doesn't arrive, do they get stuck? Can they devise an alternative route to get to work or to get to school? Can they maintain their notebooks and assignments and rooms and their desk? Are they organized? Do they know how to plan an assignment? Do they know how to tidy their room? Or is there chaos and order? How are multi-step tasks and projects experienced? Are they daunting or are they delightful? It's a challenge and really embraced. Are deadlines met, or are things not accomplished? They need extra time, as we talked about before. Is the quality compromised? Again, using that cognitive lens is really important here, because sometimes people that have difficulties here, and I'm sure you would have heard this about someone you know that show these behaviors, they could be called lazy, they're not trying, or they're not paying attention. Here's some other examples. Is there a leader in a group that relies, is there a leader, or do they rely on others? Are they headed for student council or not? What about the experience of receiving a disappointing mark or a feedback? Can they take the feedback on board, or do they react to that? Can they learn from the feedback and modify their behavior, or actually they're not understanding it, or they again react to that? Is their life littered with social blunders, putting their foot in their mouth, or misunderstanding a situation? These all could point to underperforming cognitive functions that are being used in executing tasks, in goal setting, in planning and organizing in a social situation. So you've already done your own assessment. You've already used a cognitive lens to look at executive function. There's two other tools that you could use. There's a cognitive questionnaire, which is here, and Sarah will put up a QR code for this at the end as well. So two ways here. You can complete this cognitive questionnaire, and it will tell you the cognitive functions that are working really well or working strongly, and it will tell you the cognitive functions that are potentially underperforming. Remember, in the cognitive questionnaire, when you complete it, you will get a report. Remember to save that. It will prompt you to save it, but we do not get the results of that. So you can't come back to us and say, hey, I would like my report. We don't save it for privacy reasons. So you'll need to save that report at the end. Save it or print it, something like that. And then there's an Arrowsmith cognitive assessment where we can assess all of the different functions. And Sarah can do this. We assess all of the different cognitive functions and we pull together the cognitive profile for that individual. And the good news is that using neuroplasticity, the power of the brain to change itself, we can always strengthen these cognitive functions. Okay, we've assessed it now. We know either we've got a strong cognitive function, executive function, or perhaps it's underperforming. The good news is we can strengthen it. No matter where we are, we might want it to be really stronger than where it is already, or you might know that it's underperforming and you want to make it even stronger again. And we can do this through neuroplasticity and very targeted cognitive exercise using these principles of neuroplasticity, which are here on the screen. Just add a couple of more ideas about neuroplasticity. Yes, the brain can change. Very, very positive. However, it's a neutral concept. Neuroplasticity is neutral. The brain can change. It can be very positive, or we can actually change the brain in a negative way. So, of course, when we are intentionally starting out to strengthen the brain, we want to make sure we're strengthening it in a positive direction. And the good news is we have control over that. So we will find the right cognitive exercise to strengthen the brain in a positive direction. Our brain is changing all the time. We cannot not learn. And though the last point here is really important, the brain adapts to what it does most. And anyone that heard my last presentation on attention, I really highlighted that because I think we sometimes forget that and we rewire our brains unintentionally. We can rewire our brains in a negative way. So the power of neuroplasticity, we don't have to keep going down a particular path. We can turn it around and send our brain in a positive direction. So it's really important. It's very exciting, actually. And the power of the brain is amazing. When we use the power of, I'm just checking the time, making sure I'm on time. When we use the power of neuroplasticity, we can strengthen those 4 cognitive functions that I just talked about before. I'm not going to read these. You'll see them in the recording. But this is what happens when we strengthen, when we increase or strengthen or enhance symbolic thinking, the left prefrontal, planning and organizing in language. When we strengthen nonverbal thinking, that planning and organizing in non-language. When we strengthen predicative speech, the steps of doing a task, or when we strengthen symbol relations, the most critical cognitive function that we use every day. This is what can happen when we enhance that using the principles of neuroplasticity. I'd love to let you hear this Arrowsmith student. He's going to talk for just a few minutes. Again, Sarah will have this in a document that she sends out to you. But let's listen to Michael, just a couple of minutes, and he can tell you about what his life was like. And hopefully you'll hear the sound.
My name's Michael. I've struggled my entire life, grades 1 to 12, preschool, middle school, high school, with organization, with keeping up with conversations, trying to listen to a teacher, take notes, try and follow along, and never, ever, ever, ever in my entire journey succeeded. I thought there must be something wrong with me. How can all the other kids in, my class take notes? When I was 21 years old, I kind of had my enough is enough moment. And I signed up for a marathon, gave myself 4 months to train for it. And it ended up being in 2014 in Niagara Falls, and I ended up coming 6th place. I looked at myself and I said, okay, I can't study, I can't learn, I can't focus on anything, but I have this gift for pain, how to transfer these emotions that no one understands what I'm going through. No one understands, what's going on inside of me, and I'm told I can't do anything, that I'm going to be a waste of a life in my life. Pain got me there. Anger got me there. Not confidence in myself with, compartmentalizing and having organization. I was still a mess when I was training. I knew how to show up to a race, do what I had to do, but at the end of the day, my mind was still a mess. I met my fiance Mari, and we were going for a walk downtown Toronto. And I kept complaining to my fiance, saying, Mari, you don't understand what I go through. You have a conversation with me, I can follow a few bits of it for a few minutes, and then I'm lost. My mind, I feel like I'm drowning. I cannot keep up. I cannot focus. I could focus on one thing at a time, and that's it. I can't compartmentalize anything else. And on that walk, we stumbled upon a book called The Woman Who Changed Her Brain. So after doing my psychological evaluation, the program that for me was going to help change my brain was called Clocks. Currently, I started this program on March 17th, 2021. Now in June 2022, I'm currently on level 10, but I can tell you right now, it has changed my life. I cannot tell you what it's done to my confidence in organization, in focus, in siloing any topic, pulling it up like a tab on the computer, seeing what it is I gotta do, seeing all the tasks I gotta do. I'm able to organize my day, my weeks, my months on my own without having anybody to tell me what to do. And I have to thank Aerosmith, because I never thought I'd have the capacity to do all these things that I could never do before. Currently in my life, I'm a finance manager. When I started in my role, due to my capacity, I was only able to manage one entity. I now manage 8 entities. I've grown, I've 8 times my capacity in my role since starting Aerosmith. My anxiety, which I've suffered with my entire life, has tremendously decreased. My confidence has risen since I have been on this journey. Finally, after 29 years, I'm able to learn anything new pretty quickly, and I can take notes for the first time after listening to someone in an organized manner and in a compartmentalized, siloed way. This has been a game changer in my life, and I cannot tell you how much suffering I've done without having this skill. This is a skill that I didn't know I'd ever be able to accomplish, and I'm 29, and I've just gotten it now, and I'm so grateful for it. I want to finish this off with one thing. Before doing this program, my life internally was a mess, and I did not think I'd ever be able to fix it. I believed it was broken, and now I believe that I'm finally at a place where I can try new things, do new things. I could learn something new and actually retain it for the first time.
Always inspiring to listen to Michael. Let me move the slide. There we are. So I'm going to spend really quick amount of time looking at the research. So there's a number of research studies that researchers around the world have done on various aspects of the Aerosmith program. And this is what they've found. There's different ways that they measure this. The first one is brain scans, actually. And so what is happening in the neural networks in the brain? That's what this slide is showing. Those networks that I talked about, those 4 networks, they see the strengthened connectivity, both between the networks and within the networks. So that's really important. And in the brain imaging, they're seeing more efficient processing, increased brain activation and connectivity, and increased activation in the prefrontal cortex, increased activation in the executive control network. Really important. So right on point for executive functioning. What this slide is showing here is the networks, the brain networks for students without learning difficulties. These are students that, this is what the brain normally looks like in those 4 networks there that you can see, and then between the networks on the right-hand side. But what does it look like for students that have learning difficulties? You'll see that there are a lot of those networks are hyper-connected. They're working much stronger than they need to. And then you also see underperforming networks. Anyone that has knows someone that struggles with learning knows that they work really, really, really hard. They work longer and harder than a lot of people doing the same task. That's what we're seeing here in the network, connectivity. Because the connections that are hypo-connected or underperforming, the stronger networks have to compensate for those underperforming networks. Researchers found that after 10 months of an Arrowsmith program doing symbol relations, or in the intensive program that can happen over a 6-week period or 8 weeks, depending on how that's delivered, those networks come back to being more towards the networks of those without a learning difficulty. The brain calms down. Those hyper-connected calm down, and those hypo-connected become stronger. And that's what we also see in the behavior of students that do this, because everything calms down for them, because everything is starting to make sense. And like Michael talked about, they are now able to manage what they need to manage. Everything isn't as hard as it used to be. I'll keep this up for a short time. Don't expect you to read all of these, but the researchers also look at cognition measures. So cognitive function measures in the cognitive domains. And these are the pieces that I put in green here, the ones that are directly related to executive function. But these are the overall results. And then they also use standardized measures to measure the academic achievement of people, and you'll see those here. They're directly related with outcomes in academics. And then they also took measures of social and emotional well-being. And this is what they see. Again, you'll see this in the recording that you get, but these are the results. Quickly now, before I turn over to Sarah, what is Arrowsmith? It's a cutting-edge evidence-based program. It's a cognitive program. It's not an academic program. It's not a strategy-based program. It's a cognitive program, enhancing the particular cognitive functions of the brain. It's backed by science. Science was used to create it and continues to be used to investigate it. It uses the principles of neuroplasticity that I talked about, and it strengthens the brain to learn and operate more efficiently and effectively. It's been in operation for more than 48 years and now across the world. One difference about Arrowsmith, it is a capacity-based program. For those of us that are used to supports in schools where we use strategies to work or modifications where we use either strengths or we accommodate around the challenges, that's one way, except that doesn't always work. A capacity-based program, rather than working around a challenge, we change the capacity of the person. We change the brain. So we make those neural networks strong. Sometimes people ask us, is it a skill or a strategy that Arrowsmith works on? No, not really. If you think about it like this, the cognitive function is a brain process, the underlying brain process that we need to do a task. Like I gave examples before. To learn a skill, you need the cognitive function to be working. So the skill is here, but underlying the skill are these cognitive functions or brain processes that are required to learn the skill. Sorry. So we need to have the cognitive function operating well in order to learn the skill. And that's where I'm going to finish. I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Sarah.
Thank you, Debbie.
No worries.
And before we answer questions that were, or recap questions that were posed in the form and questions that audience may have today, I wanted just to run through a couple of practical aspects, or rather emphasizing what Debbie mentioned on school supports. Think of it of keeping someone afloat as a life-saving boat, whereas we're looking at building that cognitive bridge so that we don't need to be saved. Now, one aspect of workarounds is that our brain is a use it or lose it brain. So what we do more often will have, if you allow me the metaphor, well-carved paths in the snow. Paths we don't use will erase over time. And so we need to think very carefully when, if we go in a direction of having a workaround and strategies to cope, we will use even less those networks that need strengthening. Now, the practical aspect of Arrowsmith is that to target those networks, those brain networks that Debbie mentioned, cognitive functions, to make sure we're not creating workarounds. The exercises are individualized, they're intensive, and targeting those specific functions. And I put a picture of a diagram that wants to represent a synaptic space between two neurons. The idea of this intensity is that we're maxing out the capacity at the synaptic space, which means that if we really push it, a new receptor will be appearing, and if we continue regularly with intensity, that will stay for as long we keep the action. And as soon as our function is at average level, average is great, we don't need to continue exercising because normal life will take care of it, provided we have a healthy and socially active life. Now, I put here some images of some of what some of the exercises look like in practice. Here in this classroom in Barcarena, where I see students face-to-face, who also work online. The mode of these exercises can be in a computer, pen and paper, or auditive, depending on the type of cognitive function. And there's no age limit. And in terms of youngest, I think perhaps 6 or yes. And we mean it with age limit, is that we work with adults, and we will be talking soon about cognitive reserve in another event. We also go to schools. We operate at OEDS International School at the moment, and we are talking to other schools too in offering the program. So we start with having a profile, knowing where on that line of performance each of our functions are. And within a group setting, this is quite, I think for me, is quite special. Within a group setting, each student is working on their own individualized, customized at a level and pace and goal, which is something we wanted to achieve in many aspects of education, and Arrowsmith has it worked out for the cognitive enhancement. We've seen the case study on one of the case studies on executive functioning. The website, both mine and Arrowsmith, point to many other case studies. And Michael's case, the function that he worked on was symbol relations, but for other students, the weakness could be in a different area. If you've not been to a webinar with me before, I've worked for more than 25 years in education, always wanting to increase opportunities. And I found that beyond improving pedagogy and access, we really needed to look at the brain. And I think that is the future of education, to bring the brain into it. I was going to spare the equation being a mathematician, but yes, we need to put it there too. The questionnaire that Debbie mentioned, I'm going to put the link on the chat, but you can point your phone at this QR code too. That takes about 30 minutes to do when you get that report that Debbie mentioned. It's a good first step. If you want to contact me, I'm happy to look at the report. Again, you have to explicitly send it to me. Happy to discuss that. That's my email and our website. Now, Debbie, I was going to ask you for a little bit of input, but perhaps we look at the questions, yes, and then we can come back to the other aspects, okay? So some of you, thank you so much for comments and questions already put on the form. I think we've covered quite a few of these, Debbie, as in, yes, I think you. So we talked about, yeah. Yes, do you want to comment on these, Debbie?
No, go ahead. And I'll let you start.
Yes, so some of the people that registered for this webinar mentioned their own children having difficulties with decision making and planning, starting and finishing tasks. And in terms of what we can do, as Debbie mentioned, there are traditional approaches with workarounds and breaking down things in steps. A cognitive approach would strengthen the functions amongst the ones that Debbie mentioned, specifically those four, but potentially others that may pop up in the cognitive profile. So what we can do is we can strengthen the networks, and not any exercise will do. We need targeted exercises in a neuroplastic regime that will create long-lasting change. Debbie, do you want to comment on any of the others?
Yeah, I'll just quickly touch some of the others. The next one is talking about self-management and self-regulation skills. As I said in my presentation, strengthening executive function will help that self-management and self-regulation. That is exactly the role of executive function. So we exercise by exercising self-management and self-regulation. We're doing that when we're solving problems. The challenge is if they're underperforming, if those cognitive functions are underperforming, we're actually not exercising them. So in neuroplasticity, there's this concept of use it or lose it. So when we use it, we continue to strengthen it. But if it's underperforming, we tend not to use it. So when we, like Sarah was just saying, if we put in strategies or accommodations, or, which is what can happen, we find someone else to do the work for us, we actually are not exercising the functions that we need. And so they're not being strengthened naturally. So they're even becoming worse than they are. So it's important that we find the right cognitive tool to strengthen those cognitive functions. What to do when other approaches have not worked. So Sarah and I both have touched on strategies, compensations, and these work to a particular point. For example, if a child cannot work out how to organize their morning from waking up to going to school, we will give them a set of diagrams to say you have to do this first, then this first, then this first, then this first. We plan with our executive function. We loan them our executive function. We create the plan for them, and they are not using executive function to follow that plan. It is just an operational task. They're just doing those particular tasks. The challenge with this, and this is where approaches have not worked, the challenge is when we only put in strategies or accommodations, we cannot set up someone for every task they need to do in their life. We can't predict that. It's not possible to give someone enough strategies for every task, because every task has its own set of strategies that you need to go through to execute the task. So it's not possible. And that's why, you know, Michael was talking about in his speech there that, you know, probably at school he had various strategies that he could use to get him through school. But when he got to work, he was expected to hold up 8 balls, and he couldn't do that. He could only focus on one client. Now he can do 8, but he could only do 1 before. So it would have been very frustrating for him and his employer, because he couldn't do the task efficiently and effectively. He's probably one of those people that I spoke about when I was using those examples before that would take work home. It's simply because we can't give someone enough skills and strategies to do the task without, to make it efficient. We have to go to that function level. We have to strengthen those networks. I think what classroom? Okay, so what classroom and at home approaches support? I am not going to say don't use those strategies. If your child is struggling, you have to help them. You can't just say to them, work it out on your own. If you know that they have struggles with executive function, you can't pull away your own executive function from them. They absolutely have to do it. And one of the things that I love about the cognitive questionnaire, and even the cognitive lens that I've asked you to use today, is it's given you a sense for someone that you know, whether their executive function is strong or not. If you think that someone's executive function is underperforming, please help them. They need the help. Until they're able to strengthen the function. You can't just say, oh, you know, you've got to use the function. If we know it's underperforming, it's not going to strengthen by itself. So it has to have a very targeted stimulation. So I ask you to recognize the struggle and work with that person with compassion and understanding until they can get the support to strengthen the function so that they then can work without the help.